Thank you, Jason. Appreciate you leading that last song. Beautiful song. First song, too. Appreciate that as well. Appreciate everybody joining in the singing of those songs. We do have a number of visitors with us. We've always said we appreciate our visitors. We really do, and encourage you to stick around and let us get to know you a little better afterwards. And if you have a question about anything that we teach or practice here, we always extend an invitation for you to reach out. Let's have a conversation about that. We want to be right with God, and we want you to as well. And so we all are just striving to be what God would have us to be. So it's not complicated. We'd be glad to talk with you if you'd like. And I would just like to emphasize something else that Ken said. We've been trying to emphasize this all along, but it doesn't matter how old you are, the youth weekend is for you. You don't have to join in all the other stuff that would break your arthritic back. You don't have to do all that stuff. But to be here when Brother Roberts is presenting the gospel of Christ, no matter how old you are, you will benefit from that. And so please, we encourage young folks of all ages to be here for the lessons that Mark Roberts will be presenting here in a couple of weeks. A VIP, most of you know what that means, a very important person. In some circles, of course, the VIP list is a very exclusive list. Everybody who's anybody wants to be on the VIP list. The question is, does God have a VIP list? In one sense, of course, everyone is on God's VIP list. I think that's the implication of John 3:16, that God loved the entire world so much that he gave his only begotten Son. Well, of course, we are all very important people in the eyes of God, and he has no exclusive list, as the world does, of his favorites based upon some worldly criteria. Of course, he does not have that kind of a list, but God does have a list. In Revelation chapter 21, and in verse 27, one of several passages in the Bible that references the Lamb's book of life. And whoever was not written, whoever's name was not found in the Lamb's book of life, was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone. I want to be on that list. And I think you do too. That's why you're here this morning. We want to be on the Lamb's list. We want to be found in his book of life. And so the question is, how do you go about doing that? How do we go about getting onto God's VIP list, the Lamb's book of life? We might ask the question, do rich people get on that list? Because after all, God doesn't always speak kindly about rich folks, now does he? So many passages in the Old Testament and the New Testament provide those kinds of warnings. Amos is just one of many of the prophets that spoke about that. In chapter 6 and verse 1, woe unto those who are at ease in Zion, to those who feel secure on the mountain of Samaria. Verse 4, woe to those who lie on beds of ivory and stretch themselves out on their couches, and they eat lambs from the flock, calves from the midst of the stall. In other words, the very best of the meat. They sing idle songs to the sound of the harp. In verse 6, they drink wine in bowls, and they anoint themselves with the finest of oils. These are the rich folks in the northern kingdom of Israel. But he said they are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. When you turn over to the New Testament in James chapter 5, you'll find the same kind of warning. James 5, beginning in verse 1, come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded. Their corrosion will be evidence against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. Behold the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, or crying out against you. And in verse 6, you have condemned and murdered the righteous. Sounds very much like God doesn't think much of rich folks. That maybe rich folks can't make it into the Lamb's book of life. The story of Lazarus and the rich man In Luke chapter 16, the passage that Kenton read for us a few moments ago. I'm not going to reread the entire story there, but in verse 19, if you'll take up in Luke 16 and verse 19, there was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, who feasted sumptuously every day. That means he ate the best of the best. And at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. You know, in the Greek, the word there is a beggar. In fact, there are several Greek words that could describe a poor man, but this is like the poorest of the poor. And in verse 22, the poor man died and was carried by the angels into Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried, and in Hades he lifted up his eyes, being in torment. So it sounds like, on the surface that maybe rich folks not going to make it into God's book of life. Because a lot of folks, that's really the way they work, that's the way they look at this. That's the way a lot of folks look at life today. They look at rich versus poor. We've talked about Marxism, the spiritual implications of Marxism. We've talked about that before. We're not into the politics of all of that, but there are spiritual considerations. And so you'll hear a lot of folks talking in this day and time about the rich folks and how bad the rich folks are. And they kind of couch it all in terms of the rich versus the poor. And the inherent implication is if you're rich, you're bad, and if you're poor, you're good. Let's be clear, the rich man in Luke chapter 16 was not condemned because he was rich. We understand that, right? Nor was Lazarus exalted because he was poor. The fact that the rich man was rich and the fact that Lazarus was poor was really not the issue. It says that the poor man, the beggar, was laid at the gate of the rich man. Now there's the crux of the story. Because here's this beggar who would love to have just eaten the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. No one gave him anything to eat. You see, the problem wasn't that the rich man was rich. The problem was that the rich man was selfishly rich. That he had his money, he wasn't interested in anybody else, not that poor guy sitting at his gate. It implies that he had no compassion for those who were poor. And in fact, did you pick up on that in Amos chapter 6? We read, about these rich folks who are just living the high life, right? In the last part of verse 6, but they are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. That is, they didn't care about spiritual things. They didn't care that the northern kingdom was in full-blown apostasy. They didn't care that Jehovah worship had been pushed to the side in favor for all of the gods of the Canaanites where they had lived. They didn't care about that. They didn't care about spiritual things. And all of the things that were associated with that, which involved quite often the abuse of those who did not have the money or the power. And that was a problem. Same thing we saw in James chapter 5. We just kind of glossed over it, but go back again to James chapter 5 and verse 4. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields and was kept back by fraud. Now there's a problem. It's not that the rich people had the fields. It's not that the poor folks were working for the rich folks. That's not the problem. The problem was the rich folks were defrauding the poor folks, and they were crying out against them. Even said in verse 6, you have condemned and murdered the righteous. The rich were not condemned because they were rich. They were condemned because they were ungodly in their riches. The poor were not always exalted either, by the way. God doesn't always speak highly of the poor. Being poor is not inherently virtuous, as some people would have you to believe. In Proverbs chapter 28 and in verse 3, Solomon there actually describes a poor man who oppresses the poor. Well, how could that be? Well, because poor people can be bad too. Poor people can be just as evil as rich folks. And God doesn't always speak harshly about those who are rich. Some of the most righteous folks that we read about in the Bible actually were very wealthy. Abraham certainly comes to mind. That's Genesis 13. And in verse 2, Abraham was very rich, in livestock, silver and gold. We don't always think about Abraham as being a rich guy. We think of him as an itinerant herder of sheep or something like that. But no, he was very wealthy. And this was very early in the Abraham story, by the way, in chapter 13. Job. We know about Job and his sufferings, his trials and tribulations and all of that. But the book of Job tells us, once again, very early in the Job story, it describes his many possessions in those early verses of the book of Job. Lots of possessions, thousands of sheep and camels and all of that. And he was described there as the greatest of all the people of the East. And yet Job in the Old Testament and in the New Testament is described as a righteous man. See, the money wasn't the problem, not in the case of Abraham, not in the case of Job. They had the money, still maintained their righteousness. How about in the New Testament? You remember a guy by the name of Joseph, Joseph of Arimathea, as he's described in Matthew chapter 27. After Jesus had been crucified and he had breathed his last, it was getting toward the Sabbath day. And so he goes in verse 57 of Matthew 27. This rich man, he's described as a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph. He was a disciple of Jesus. That tells you about the character of the man. He was a true disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus, and Pilate ordered it to be given to him, which also tells you about Joseph of Arimathea. Not anyone could just go in and demand an audience from Pilate and ask for the body of this guy who'd just been crucified outside of town. Not anybody could have done that. Joseph of Arimathea, he had the credentials. He had the money. He had the connections. And so he goes to the governor and requests the body of Jesus, and Pilate ordered it to be done. In verse 57 or 59, Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud. He laid it, listen to this, he laid it in his own new tomb, which he had cut out of a rock. He owned the rock, he owned the property that the rock sat on, and he had a tomb chiseled out of that rock. That's not a poor man thing. That's a rich man thing. But Joseph of Arimathea did that. And all of that, of course, part of the burial and resurrection story of Jesus, which is a story of obviously all to itself. But Joseph of Arimathea played an important part in that, and yet he is described as a rich man. How can that be? It's because God is impartial in his judgments. Peter said this to Cornelius, who also was a man of some means. He was a centurion. He was rather up the ranks in the Roman army. He had servants. He had stuff. But in Acts chapter 10 and verse 34, Peter talks to Cornelius and this whole household here, a bunch of Gentiles, by the way, and he says, God shows no partiality. But in every nation, anyone who is poor, that's not what he said. Anyone who is rich, that's not what he says. In every nation, anyone who fears God and does what is right is acceptable with him. I don't read anything there about rich or poor. And so if we ask the question, do rich people make it into God's VIP list? Are they in the Lamb's book of life? The answer is sometimes. Sometimes they are. Yeah, sometimes the rich folks are there, but it's not because they are rich. And if poor folks make it, it's not because they're poor. It's because they fear God and do what's right. Hey, this is not complicated, is it? How about influential people, very similar to rich folks, because sometimes they're one and the same thing. Money can buy influence, no doubt about that. Let's just think in terms of those who have the power, those who have the influence. Once again, God does not always speak kindly of those who are powerful and influential. And that's true if you want to look at Pharaoh, The most powerful man in that part of the world, arguably the most powerful man in the world at that time, in the time of Moses. And so God tells Moses, go and tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And so Moses goes to Pharaoh and he says, let God's people go. And Pharaoh said, who is he? He said, I don't know him. Exodus chapter 5 and verse 2. Who is Jehovah, Pharaoh says, that I should obey his voice? Powerful man. And he was not going to be influenced by this Moses guy. But from Pharaoh through the New Testament, the story of Pilate, 3 times Pilate declared that Jesus was an innocent man. 3 times Pilate said, I find no cause of death in him. I will chastise him and I will release him. And the people cried out and said, no, crucify him. And finally he said, okay. He had the power to have him crucified or to release him. Jesus said, yeah, that power comes from God, but he had the power to do it. He chose to appease the crowds rather than to release Jesus. I know Chris Johnson's not here this morning, but he did a talk Wednesday night, and he said that he had covered some of the stuff that I'd covered last Sunday. And I was going to tell him if he had been here, I'm covering some of the stuff here now that he covered Wednesday night. So, but he said he put his talk together before I did my sermon last Sunday, and I was going to tell him, hey, I put this sermon together before Wednesday night. And so it is what it is. But in his talk, if you remember, if you were here Wednesday night, Chris made the comment that those who are the educated, those who are the elite in society, again, the influential people, they're the ones most likely to be atheists. They're the ones most likely to be the pagans if they have any religious affiliations at all. They're the ones most likely to despise the meek and the gentle as Jesus describes them. In Matthew 5 and in verse 5 in the Beatitudes, that Sermon on the Mountain, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. God does not always look upon the powerful and the influential very kindly. Instead, he exalts those who are meek and humble. Did you know most of the saved people in the world you've never met, and you wouldn't know their names if you heard them? They may be blue-collar workers, they may not. They may be stay-at-home moms, they may not. Nothing inherently virtuous about being a blue-collar worker, by the way. It's kind of like rich and poor. There's no inherent positive or negative on either side of that. A lot of blue-collar guys are not godly individuals, and a lot of white-collar guys are. You see, there's nothing inherently good or bad about that. Same thing with stay-at-home moms. Not all stay-at-home moms are good moms, godly mothers. And not all mothers who go out into the workforce for whatever reason are ungodly mothers. Once again, there's not an inherent virtue in those things. But the Bible certainly tells moms, blue-collar workers, and all the rest of us how we ought to live in whatever role we live in life, whatever role we serve. If you want to look at God's view of influential people, look at passages like 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and in verse 11, aspire, Paul is telling Christians at Thessalonica, aspire to live quietly, to mind your own affairs, and I think it's the King James that says mind your own business, and I like that. Mind your own business. Work with your hands. Stay busy. Stay constructively occupied. That's what God tells us to do. When you turn over to the book of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 11, we have quite a list in Hebrews chapter 11 of these men and women of faith. And many of those names that are ticked off there, you'd certainly be familiar with. And so we have Enoch. and we have Abraham, and we have Sarah. And we can just work our way on down the list. I mean, so we've got Joseph, and we've got Moses, of course. And you just work your way on down the list. He mentions David and several of the judges, specifically by name. And so we know those guys. We know those names. But then there's this little paragraph in Hebrews chapter 11. Let's take up in verse 35. Actually, midway through verse 35. There were some who were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. There were others who suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with a sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. All of these, he says, though were commended through their faith. Who were these people? Some were this, and others were this, and they were doing this. And he doesn't even name them here. Doesn't even give us the names of these people, but they were commended by God because of their faith. Did you know half of the people on the ark? We don't even know their names. What were the names of Noah's sons? We know that. What were the names of his daughters-in-law? We don't know that. Gideon's 300. We know Gideon, right? Who were those 300 guys who defeated an entire army of the Midianites? Who were those guys? Yeah, we don't even know their names. Elijah's 7,000, those 7,000 who would not bow the knee to Baal in the northern kingdom. Read from Amos a while ago, we're talking about those guys. And they would not bow the knee to Baal. Who were those 7,000? I don't know, but God knew every name. He knew every one of them, and their name was in the Lamb's Book of Life. We know the story of Naaman, the Syrian general, and we know about how powerful he was. What was the name of his wife's servant girl? What was her name? Did you know you wouldn't even have the story of Naaman the leper if it wasn't for her? She's the one that triggered that story. She's the one that told her boss, said, hey, I know a guy. I know a guy. And so it was told to Naaman, and Naaman sends to Ahab, and Ahab says, what, are you trying to start a war or something? And finally, he goes, and you have the whole story of Naaman being cleansed of his leprosy. But we don't even know her name, do we? The little servant girl. Who was the publican in Luke chapter 18? Who Jesus says went to his house justified rather than that self-righteous Pharisee. What was the publican's name? We don't know. We don't know who he was. But he was justified in God's eyes. What was the name of the Good Samaritan? Yeah, I don't know. What was the name of the Philippian jailer? I don't know. We just go on and on and on, you see. We don't know the names of most of those people. Most of them were not particularly influential, but they all made it into the Lamb's Book of Life. The Philippian jailer himself actually did have some influence. He had some power. But he also made it into the Lamb's Book of Life, which again, doesn't it answer the question, do influential people make it into the Lamb's Book of Life? Well, sometimes. Sometimes they do. Once again, it depends. If they do, it's not because they are powerful people, it's because they're faithful people. And whether you're in a position of influence or whether you're a nobody, God knows you. And you can still be in His book of life. You can be one of His very important people if you will be faithful in your service to Him. Let's just go ahead and throw this one in while we're having the conversation. How about attractive people? Once again, in the world, you know, it's the beautiful people that want to be a part of that, whatever the VIP list is. Or maybe it's those who are strong, who are very physically powerful and that sort of thing. Once again, God's view of all of this is so different from ours. And so we read about Jezebel in 2 Kings chapter 9. When Jehu comes doing God's work, Jezebel finds out that he's coming. And you know what she does? In chapter 9 and in verse 30, Jezebel painted up her eyes and she adorned her head and then looked out the window. She thought, maybe I can entice this guy. Did you know before the sun went down that day, the beautiful Jezebel was dog poop? Might have been the next day, but we won't get into the details. But that's the way it's described. Just read those verses. I won't read the rest of it there through verse 37. But once again, God was not impressed by her beauty. Same thing with Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17. We know about Goliath. He's described as this massive man, this man of war. And he's described in very physical terms, and he's taunting the entire army of Israel, and they all are cowered before him until the faithful David comes and challenges him, kills him, cuts off his head. God wasn't impressed with Goliath's physical strength. What do Jezebel and Goliath have in common? Both of them were enemies of the God of Israel. And both of them paid a very dear price for it. And what about those who are not so beautiful and strong? The unattractive ones. And I know I'm not talking about anybody in this audience, but those people are out there. Proverbs chapter 31, Proverbs 31 and verse 30. Charm is deceitful, beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Yeah, ladies, I mean, it doesn't matter, how beautiful you are. The time will come when your body will go back to the dust, just like all of ours will. As a people of God, we got to be okay with that. It can be hard, not just for the women, but for the men as well. It can be hard when you realize that old age is catching up to you and gravity is doing its thing. But God is not looking at that. We have the passage up there in Isaiah chapter 53. Most of you know what that chapter is about. That is that messianic chapter of this servant of God who would come and take upon himself the sins of the world. Did you know this is the only chapter that describes the physical appearance of Jesus? We don't read anything about the physical appearance of Jesus in the New Testament, nothing. This passage says in Isaiah 53 and in verse 2 that even though he grew up as a young plant, like a root out of dry ground, he had no form or majesty that we should look upon him, no beauty that we should desire him. I don't think it's saying that Jesus was ugly, but it's saying he wasn't handsome either. Jesus was not the guy like Hollywood depicts him to be, that everybody looks at him and goes, whoa. He wasn't that guy. He looked like any other common Jewish guy in the first century, walking down the road. Jesus was not the physically dominant man. Now, I will hasten to say that holiness is not a virtue either. Ugly people can be mean too. God doesn't care, though, and this is the point. God doesn't care if you're plain, if you're homely, if you're downright ugly, as long as you're godly. That's what matters to God. We actually read about some beautiful women in the Bible that were very godly women. Sarah is one of those that comes to mind. Same thing with some of the men. David is a man after God's own heart, but he was described as a very handsome young man. And so if we ask the question once again, can attractive people make it to God's VIP list? Can they make it into the Lamb's Book of Life? Yeah, sometimes they can. Sometimes they can if they are godly people. And the looks really don't enter into the equation at all. If we had the time, we could get into a conversation about congregations. You know, people think of churches the same way. And so they're looking for the big churches, the big buildings, the cathedrals. They're looking for the big attendance numbers. They're looking for all of that. And you know, God doesn't care about any of that. The numbers only matter to God to the extent that each number represents a soul. But He's not looking for the large crowds. God does with us today the same thing that He did when He was talking with Samuel the prophet. Remember that? Saul the king had been deposed as the king in God's eyes. It was just a matter of time before he was actually done with being the king of Israel. But God was now ready to appoint another king. And so we have all the sons of Jesse trotted out in front of the prophet Samuel. And Samuel looks at the oldest, Eliab, and he says, wow, this is the guy. This is the guy. He looks like a king. And do you remember what God told Samuel on that occasion? He said, no, Samuel, this is not the guy. Man looks on the outward appearance, but God looks on the heart. You want to make it to God's VIP list? You want to make it into the Lamb's Book of Life? There are certain fundamental things you've got to do. You've got to get them right. Talk about hearing the gospel, right? Well, hearing means more than just hearing, right? It means hearing, taking it to heart. Belief is more than just mentally agreeing to certain things. It means that I am convicted from the inside out. It's a conviction or an assurance, as it's described in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1 in some of your translations. It's an assurance. This is a heart thing when we're talking about faith. When we talk about repentance, that is a heart thing. It means that I've changed my mind. I've changed my heart. I don't want to live this way anymore. I want to turn my life around and start living like God wants me to live. When we talk about even confession, acknowledging to people my faith in Christ, that comes from my heart. It's not just words. It's not just a formula. It's something that comes from the heart. And when I'm baptized into Christ, Peter tells us in 1 Peter chapter 3 that baptism is an interrogation of God or an asking of God for a clean conscience. It's when we ask God to cleanse our conscience. That is what baptism is. So even if we talk about the steps to salvation, hear, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized, we are talking about things that happen from the heart. From the heart. Which is really the whole point of the lesson, right? Can rich people make it into heaven? Can they make it onto God's VIP list? Yeah, if they have the right heart. Influential people, powerful people, yeah, if they have the right heart. How about beautiful people? Attractive people, yeah, if they have the right heart. And so the question of the hour is, do you have the heart? Do you have the heart that God is looking for? The invitation is open to you. If you are in any way subject to it, we encourage you to come while we stand and sing.